The word philosophy means love of wisdom in Greek, and philosophy is all about trying to gain wisdom and understanding about the way the world works. In this video, I'm going to talk about how one philosopher, in his quest to gain wisdom, forever altered the course of philosophy and all of Western civilization along with it. That philosopher is Plato, and his revolutionary idea is called the theory of forms. But in order to really understand just how tremendously important Plato was, we first have to look at what philosophy was all about before him. Before Plato, philosophers in and around ancient Greek directed their quests for wisdom at one objective. They wanted to find the basic principle at the root of reality, the basic stuff underlying everything that exists. And as these philosophers, they're called the Presocratic philosophers, by the way, because they came before Plato and his teacher Socrates, but as each of these philosophers tried to think through this question of what the basic principle of reality might be, they each came up with a different explanation. Interestingly, though, there's something that all these different explanations have in common. They all suggested that the first principle was some kind of material thing. None of these pre-Socratics ever thought that maybe the first principle of reality might be something immaterial or not made out of matter. Thales of Miletus, for example, the first known philosopher, suggested that the first principle of everything is water. Everything is made out of water, he said. And then a couple decades later, you had a philosopher named Anaximenes, who argued that everything in the world is just condensed air. So I'm made out of condensed air, you're made out of condensed air, the camera I'm using is just condensed air. There were some philosophers who said that everything is made up of fire, others said that everything is just made up of little seeds. There was even one guy who said that everything was made up of tiny particles called atoms separated by empty space. Fancy that. But what all of these pre-Socratic ancient Greek philosophers had in common is that they all thought that whatever the first principle of reality is, whatever is the basic stuff undergirding reality, it had to be something material. And if you'd like, I guess you could say that all of these pre-Socratic philosophers were materialists, but that might be a bit deceiving, because the word materialist implies that someone rejects the notion of the immaterial as somehow metaphysically absurd or something like that. But these pre-Socratic philosophers didn't do that. They just didn't believe that immaterial stuff existed because they had never, the notion of immaterial stuff had never crossed their mind. It would be like if you lived before Christopher Columbus in Europe and you had never heard that Native Americans existed. You wouldn't believe in the existence of Native Americans, not because you thought that they were metaphysically impossible or something. It's just that the idea that there might be people living on an undiscovered continent would have just never crossed your mind. In the same way, these pre-Socratic philosophers are technically materialists because they think that only the material world exists, but they're not really materialists in the sense that we mean the word today. But then again, they did only think that everything that existed was material stuff. But that is what all changed with Plato. Not only was Plato the first thinker in history to really comprehend what it means for a thing to be immaterial, but he also used this notion of the immaterial to answer probably the greatest paradox that plagued the pre-Socratics. You see, about a century before Plato lived, there was a philosopher by the name of Heraclitus. Heraclitus argued something that seems really contrary to common experience, but that he claimed we had to believe in order to be intellectually consistent with logic and reason and philosophy. You see, Heraclitus denied that anything is permanent. Famously, he argued that it's impossible to step in the same river twice. Why? Well, any river is made up of tiny water droplets, as we all know, and those water droplets are always flowing downstream. So by the time you get out of the river and step back in, you're stepping in different water droplets than were there a minute ago. And if all the parts of the river are totally different ones than they were before, totally different water droplets, and the river is just a composite of all its physical parts, its physical water droplets, then that river must be a totally different river than the one you stepped in a minute ago. By the same principle, Heraclitus would say that we are different people than we were when we were born, or even than we were last year, because every single cell in our body is constantly being sweat out. And if we're just the cells in our body, then we are totally different people than we were last year because every part that makes us up is different. And to be sure, this all seems really counterintuitive. and we might be tempted to just dismiss it out of hand. But Heraclitus does offer arguments for his position. So if we're going to say that his position is wrong, we have to be able to point out where his arguments go wrong. And it was in trying to prove Heraclitus wrong, to really point out where the guy made a mistake, that Plato came up with his notion of the immaterial. Yes, Heraclitus, he said, you're right that everything in the material world is always changing. If all there is to a river is just the water droplets, the material parts that make it up, then you're right. We can't step in the same river twice. But here's the thing, Heraclitus. There's more to a river than just the water droplets. There's more to anything than just its material parts, its changing material parts. Any physical thing is made up of material parts, yes, but more importantly, those changing physical parts are organized by non-changing, non-physical principles called forms. Forms, Heraclitus, aren't like anything we see, hear, and touch. They can't be affected by anything here on this earth, because they're not on this earth. They don't exist in any point in space, and they're not changed by anything that anything in space does. Forms are immaterial. They exist in a way that doesn't rely on physical stuff. And more than that, every natural object has a form, including the river you keep stepping in. So even if the physical matter of that river keeps changing, the immaterial form of the river doesn't. And that's why it remains the same river, even if all the physical parts changed. And forms are real, says Plato. In fact, they're more real even than the things of this world, because they can't be affected and changed like the things of this world. They're more permanent. In proposing that the forms are the principles of permanence in the world, therefore, Plato also gave his answer to the question of what is the first principle of reality. It's the forms, which, unlike water, air, seeds, and all the other stuff that the pre-Socratics put forward as potential first principles of reality, is immaterial. And here's where Plato left his most enduring mark on Western philosophy. It's a testament to the power of his forms that for 2,000 years, the whole quest for the first principle was almost entirely put aside, as philosophers realized the strength and effectiveness of Plato's explanation. Even philosophers like Aristotle, who proposed slightly different explanations of the first principle question, took as their starting point Plato's notion of the immaterial, because Plato had showed how easily an immaterial first principle answers some seemingly insurmountable objections to common sense, like Heraclitus's. And even today, Plato's notion of the immaterial has never been disproved. I mean, starting in the 17th century, philosophers started to reject his idea of the immaterial, but they did that more as a presupposition against it, instead of actually arguing against his position. And here's the thing. If you find yourself in the camp of those philosophers of the last 400 years, who just find something wrong in the notion of the immaterial, but can't place your finger on what it is, and you just want to reject it because of that, be prepared to understand that you might be faced with Heraclitus's paradox. Maybe you have your own answer to the paradox that doesn't involve Plato's explanation. But if you do, you would be the first to come up with it. Just be aware that you might be forced to admit that permanence is an illusion if you don't accept the notion of the immaterial. Just be aware of that. And especially be aware of that if you think you're stepping in the same river twice. But as for myself, I think I'm going to stick by old Plato on this one. Well, thank you for watching this video. If you could please like this video and subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. Thank you, and God bless.